Call to order this meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board and ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
I'm sorry, Chair, would you like to conduct the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yeah, we'll switch them.
Chair Craven?
Here.
Director Iranio?
Aye.
Director Bennett is absent. Director West?
Present.
And Director Borchard.
Here.
Mr. Borchard, would you lead us in the pledge to the flag, please?
Face our flag, put your hand over your hearts. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Are there any amendments to this agenda?
No amendments.
Okay. Public comments. Is there anyone who would like to speak to us on an item that is not on the agenda but within our purview? Yes,
Good
sir.
afternoon, Chair Craven. Andy Waters, Thermal Mutual Water Company, Chairperson, Los Pozos User Group.
Okay.
Just a quick update from our meeting today regarding the allocation program proposal. We made great strides in drafting a letter and proposal at 20,000 level to get back to the board with some options, maybe for the April meeting, so that we could have something to discuss. And I'd like to thank GMA staff for having a great meeting with us a couple weeks ago. And I think we're moving forward, and everybody's very positive. So
Good.
that's my little report.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak to us on an item that's not on the agenda? Seeing no one come forward, we'll move on to board member comments.
I have just a couple.
Certainly.
I guess in trying to get up to speed on the GMA's process and programs, I've spent a lot of time studying the 2007 Groundwater Management Plan. Chapter 6 of that plan specifically lays out a series of basin management objectives. And obviously by its terms, that was to be updated in 2012. It's a little late. I haven't seen an update. But what I would like, if it's possible, to have staff come back at the April meeting with a report updating compliance with each of those basin management objectives. And I'm not asking that they do a new study, but that they simply use existing data to report compliance from 2007 to the present so that we can get an assessment of how the existing objectives have been complied with as we plan further objectives for the future. And to the extent that there is no data, by all means, just let us know that there's no data. But if that's possible, I'd like to see that. Similarly, just a thought and a suggestion with respect to future groundwater management planning. And I know we're going to discuss a little bit of that later, but the code, was it 10720.7, allows this agency until the end of January 2020 to develop that GSP. Personally, I don't think we need to wait 5 years to do that. The organizational plan in the code allows most basins 2 full years, up until the end of 2017, to organize the institutional process necessary to develop a plan. Well, that process, those institutions are in place here. And so what I would like to see, if it's at all possible, is to have staff come back perhaps at the May meeting with a roadmap, a timeline for a 24 to 30 month period on a disaggregated basis to identify the various steps in the process from where we are now to where we will be at the end of that timeline, with plans in front of this board for review, adoption, proposal and adoption. If that's possible, so that we have a course and we can follow that course. It would also be useful to stakeholders who would be able to review that timeline and know when and where along that process they need to get their proposals to us rather than wait until the end of that process. Last question I have actually maybe is more procedural than anything else with respect to today's agenda. And again, excuse my ignorance, but with respect to items 8 and 9, they're listed as action items. but there's no action specified or noticed in the agenda. And in reviewing the board packet, there's no action suggested, proposed, or recommended. Why are these action items and not just information items? If there's a reason, I'm just curious because I mean, clarity is important, so.
Well, on one, we're giving direction to staff, so I think that's an action. That's number 9. Were you talking about 8 and 9?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And so we're going to be giving direction, and maybe they considered that an action. The other one is receive and file. I don't know why it's there, but I think staff will take note in the future, and we'll just leave it in the place for today.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. I was just trying to
Yeah.
understand how it got organized that way, that's all.
Certainly.
Could I just try to, I believe that the difference would be under informational items. They're not expecting us to do anything except hear it. That there doesn't seem to be anything, whereas, and help me, whereas under the action items, there is an opportunity, or there's even potentially more of an expectation. It's not a hard and fast rule, but an expectation that we may give them direction. Is that?
That's correct.
I think that's, so it's not like you couldn't give a direction on an informational item, but although our council may say, hey, you really can't, whereas here we have the flexibility to do that. If you have the flexibility, it needs to be listed as an action item so you're not misleading anybody and that we may take some action. That's my sense, but I appreciate the questions. I also would just offer, I agree wholeheartedly, we shouldn't have to take 7 years to get our plan together. And when you say 24 to 30, I would like to have, if it can go faster than that, it should. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Exactly. And we have done some things that hopefully have gotten us in a position where we might be able to do that. So, good.
Any other board member comments? Okay. Consent items, items 1 through 3. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second to approve the consent calendar. Any objection? We have to have a voice vote on these? No? Okay, no. So ordered. Informational items. Number 4, compliance summary report for extraction reporting filing periods 2013-2 to 2014-2 flow meter accuracy testing. Could we have the staff report, please?
Yes, good afternoon, Chair Craven and directors. For the record, my name is Kathleen Rydell, and I'm here to present item 4. This is a summary of compliance with the requirement to report extractions on a semi-annual basis and to have calibrated flow meters on the wells prior to extraction of groundwater. Those meters are to be calibrated every 3 years. So during 2014, 2013-2 and 2014-1 statements were sent out and to have been returned. And in the first quarter of 2015, 2014-2 statements were sent out. The due dates are noted here. On average, about 430 statements are sent out semi-annually. And as you can see from the compliance, that typically we have about 4 to 5% non-reporting. And then being 2 weeks after the due date, we had 86% compliance. 86% of the statements had been returned. For non-filers, notices of violation sent out for 2013-2, which was within the 2014 calendar year, 2014, and 2014-1, which was also in the calendar year. It's roughly about in the high 40s, low 50s. And you can see that we have the pretty much chronic non-reporters. The 37 not submitted, that's likely to go down, and then the incompletes represent saved. But this is likely to go down in the next month or so. We anticipate that, and you consider that the data was pulled about 2 weeks after the due date. So this is what it looked like, a snapshot in time. With each of the semi-annual extraction periods, when they close, there's a large effort to reach out to non-reporters. That includes emails, phone calls. We send out notices of violation. In general, 80% of the staff time is used to help and work with 20% of the reporters to get their statements in. And then staff reviewed the non-reporting from 2010 to 2014, and it's roughly 4% that fail to file their semi-annual extraction statements. Rather chronic. I just prepared a slide to show that we do have in save state, so those are incomplete semi-annual extraction statements. Those are ag. And then in the not submitted, we have typically these chronic non-reporters. This likely is to go down considering the data was pulled roughly 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the due date. Or this one was older. That was the previous slide. So this is likely still to go down. We're still working with non-reporters and trying to catch them up. During 2014, Resolution 2013-1 was in effect, and that changed the penalties from a flat rate of $500 to $50 a day. And so we were notifying everyone of the mounting civil penalties for non-reporting. And we received in 2014 44 requests for waivers of the civil penalties. 10 of those were first-time non-reporters, and so they were granted waivers. 34 of these requests were carried over to 2015. Currently, 7 are pending, and you can see that some were granted and some had civil penalties reduced. There are some possible solutions, just to throw out some ideas of how we might improve compliance. With automated meters, that's having them report automated, meter readings. That's a possibility. Inspections, requiring electronic filing. I know that's not possible for all, but to encourage and incentivize electronic filing of their semi-annual extraction statements. And then there's a possibility of possibly having training or certification for well operators so that they know how to fill out when statements are due, making sure that they're on the same page, that they know what the deadlines are and what to expect. So switching over to the meter calibration program. Flow meters are required to be on all wells prior to groundwater extractions. There are a few exceptions to that. We finished the second agency-wide verification of flow meter accuracy. Every 3 years, they have to have the calibration verified that it's plus or minus 5%. So in 2014, 14 notices of violation were sent out, or actually that's civil penalties. And in 2014, we had 275 first notices go out notifying people to have their meters calibrated. There were 62 notices of violation. Additional tasks associated with the meter calibration program that staff, to make the program work. Other tasks that staff do include following up on failed meters, inputting into the system the FCGMA online database is 126 repair replacement forms in 2014. There are also exemptions due to inactive meters, inactive wells, and therefore meters aren't required on inactive wells. So there's 165 of those, 2 that qualified for exemption based on a single-family residence on a parcel 1 acre or less with no income-producing operation. So 2 domestic exemptions. And then we have the 5-year waivers in 2014. As at the end of the year, there was only 1 waiver out there. So in summary, the compliance effort to follow up on semi-annual extraction statements and meters to make sure that there's calibrated meters on the wells, the effort is significant. We're making headways towards compliance, but not in all cases. And then flow meter calibration effort continues to document that there are calibrated meters associated with the wells, and the amount of second notices are significant. So recommendations, or I thank you for listening to this presentation, appreciate your feedback, and recommend that this report be received and filed.
Are there any questions?
Just one.
Yes.
And I'm not asking for names, but among the non-compliers, are there any chronic offenders?
Yes, there are.
Are they treated differently than the folks that just aren't getting their information in timely?
They are accruing civil penalties, and they get all the notices. But as far as it's just sending out the notices and putting the financial burden on them for getting their information in a timely manner.
Is that proving effective?
It's not very effective because we still have them chronically not reporting. Some of them have notified us and they are trying to work with us, but then they call us and then we don't hear back from them after giving them all the information they request so that they can get their information in. It's 6 months later or a year later and they're calling us again and gee, we're behind still. So
Is there a program in place or in process to address that so that it doesn't take 6 months or a year to remedy a year-old problem or an ongoing problem?
as far as enforcement, much more than sending civil penalty
Director West,
notices.
this is a problem we wrestle with quite a bit, and Kathleen put up a few solutions in terms of where we may address this in the long term. Another option, of course, is to revisit, we have an enforcement principles and policy where we try to treat everybody equally and fair and move through the process as quickly as possible. But you may want, your board may want to consider its civil penalty structure and whether those amounts need to be changed. You may want to consider, additional effort, maybe even staff resources, or we could work with county council in terms of perhaps more aggressive type for those 4 or 5% that are just essentially are recalcitrant.
If civil penalties alone aren't getting the job done, there may be alternatives that would be more effective, like after accruing a certain amount of civil penalties, mandating that the wireless reporting system be put in place to keep the well operating.
Certainly.
Way to get the job done and incentivize somebody to report on time rather than have to deal with the cost of building in one of those systems. But just a thought.
Sure. Well, we welcome any of those kind of creative thoughts.
Any other questions?
One more short one, but it's if I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, Gerhard, but didn't this agency spend a lot of money configuring an online reporting system that we had in mind to have up and running, and we had surmised all through that process that was going to eliminate a lot of this problem. Is that up and running? Is it serviceable?
I mean, the ability of folks to file online and pay online, yes. It's not a requirement, however.
Okay.
We've provided training, we've done, we're even developing videos, so we're trying to facilitate that, but that's not a mandate that somebody use the system, it's just an available option.
Okay.
And yes, if more would utilize it, obviously we wouldn't have the incompletes, the errors
It would catch the errors, right.
Right.
Has it helped reduce the number of chronic non-reporters?
I don't have that data to make probably that conclusion, maybe.
No, I don't think it has. And some of Kathleen's slides show that. There's a certain point where people aren't going to report, whether it's online or through the mail, and the computer system can't help with that. So the level's pretty steady with or without the computer system.
Well, to tail into Director West's comment of what's the next step there. So you have a recalcitrant individual who's racking up civil penalties day by day, but what's the next step towards bringing this thing to resolution? Is it leaning the property? Is it
certainly that
Do we just
could-
go on in this, sending letters and telling them how much they owe?
Ultimately, we'll bring those subset, those 5%, and we've done that in the past, to your board for some final disposition in front of
Okay.
your board. Then we would take it perhaps to court and perhaps lien or do some type of judicial action working with county council.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
The feedback I'd like to provide today, since this isn't an action item, this is an informational item, is that I believe as we, as we tried to get clear, like the meter calibration policies and try to get all these policies, at first there were quite a few people that weren't complying, and we had all kinds of issues, and people were saying, well, they weren't properly notified, you're sending it to the wrong address, all of that. And I believe the agency had leaned towards not having a heavy hand here, but instead trying to keep giving people more and more options. As we now have been at this for a number of years, and it's clear that people have had certainly plenty of time to be notified, et cetera. And as we are getting ready to move into a world where there will be significant penalties that could be applied for honest reporters who honestly report. I mean, we're going to have people that are going to be reporting and then getting significant fines because they fairly reported. We're going to lose confidence in that whole system if you had 4 or 5% of the people that just didn't report at all and we didn't do anything. So my own sense is it's time for us so that when we actually put a plan, our Groundwater Sustainability Agency plan in place, we have eliminated that part of it, and we know we have good data, clear data, and that everybody feels like they're in the same boat when it comes to penalties and whether they're going to have to pay or not. So I think it's time for us to ratchet it up, and quite frankly, we haven't directed staff to be more assertive than they are up to this point in time. And I think, so I would suggest that as we think about our policies down the road, we can't do that with this information item, that we emphasize we want overall a policy that everybody feels like they're all playing the same game, it's fair for everybody, and we're confident we're getting accurate data. I mean, maybe some of those people that aren't reporting are doing significant amounts of pumping that could change, the information flow that we really, need as we're trying to set policy. So that'd be the feedback I'd provide.
Okay. Robert, did you have a question, comment?
The idea that was presented here that particularly caught my mind, that I think takes care of a lot of the problems, is the putting in an AMI meter, an automatic cellular-based production meter on the wellhead that they'd be able to send up to the cloud and be able to get access to and know what's going on. I like that one. That technology has moved significantly over the past couple of years, and that would seem to take care of 2 possible problems at the same time.
Sure,
So,
I do too.
while I'm not providing direction, that was a good one, right on, and I like that one.
I agree.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Is there a motion to receive and file?
So
Second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion, a second, to receive and file. Any objection? So ordered. Item number 5, Executive Fiscal Operations Committee Board Member Assignments for calendar year 2015. Could we have that staff report, please?
Good afternoon, Chair Craven, board members. For the record, Gerhard Hubner, Watershed Protection District. I'll be introducing this item. This is item number 5. This is our annual Executive Fiscal and Operations Committee board member assignments. I'll have a quick presentation. A little bit of background again. Back in 2012, your board established through its budget study session the idea of these subcommittees, including an executive, fiscal, and operations. Each of the committees was to have 2 board members and be publicly noticed. The executive committee, if you recall, is composed of the chair and vice chair of the board, and assigned with strategic planning and prioritization of work plan items, among other tasks. Fiscal committee, as you can imagine, is the assigned to look at the budget development, tracking, pursuing of grants, or looking at anything fiscal oriented within the agency. It's currently composed of the chair and our ag representative. And lastly, we have an operations committee currently composed of our county rep and mutual water company rep, assigned by the board to discuss issues such as performance of the self-reporting and meter calibration programs, irrigation index, and other sort of day-to-day operations that the agency deals with. The committees are open to the public. We have meeting materials available, including minutes, agendas, and other materials. We have the appointed board members, of course. Agency counsel may participate, may be present. And at these committees, the board provides direction to staff as a follow-up. The committees then report back to the entire board on the work and any recommendations. That's to facilitate a discussion to use your time more efficiently. They're only held if necessary. They could be scheduled and canceled. We've done that in the past. So lastly, these are our current committee assignments. As you can see, we have a current vacancy with Dr. Kelly no longer being on the board. So with that, I will just say our recommendation today is that you select and assign the 2-member agency boards for the 3 committees for 2015. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? I just have one comment. Just to keep it clear, we don't have a mutual water company representative. We have small district representatives. Is that right? And
Yes,
that
that's
includes
more-
mutual
more
water
correct.
companies.
Yes,
Yeah. I was just going by the titles at the back.
sure.
Okay, so what are we going to do here?
If it pleases the rest of the directors, I would recommend we continue with the same distribution of duties as divvied up as we see in the packet here.
Unless anybody objects, I'll second that. That's fine.
Okay. And that's with Mr. West substituting in there where Mr. Kelly used to be.
Correct.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on that?
Controversial item.
Obviously. We're just going to move right along here today through all of this, right?
Something tells me you're about to hit the brakes.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, there's a motion and a second. Is there any objection? So ordered. Now we get on to the list of possible solutions with revised advantages and disadvantages identified for the issues, problems for developing measures to assure agency long-term sustainable groundwater management. Returning item. Could we have the staff report, please?
Thank you, Director Craven, for doing the title introduction for me so I don't have to repeat that. Also known as item 6 in today's agenda packet. I will go through a few of the background and process and goals and how we got to today. So again, as a reminder, back in April of last year, almost a year ago, you approved a plan and process for developing measures to assure long-term sustainable groundwater management. And the goal was to identify all the major issues and problems and relevant information that went along with that and identify potential solutions for the board to consider. So you had 4 basic steps: adoption of the list and issues and problems, identification of the information needed for each of the issue problems, identification of potential initial solutions, and then lastly, listing of advantages and disadvantages for each potential solution. So we've gone through step-by-step process. This is a list of actions that your board has taken as we've marched down throughout the year. So we provided you that draft list back in May of last year, with organized by issue, description, and category. Your board adopted that revised list after doing a public process. In July, the board was presented with the draft list of needed information. Subsequently, again after a public process, the board adopted at their August meeting the revised list. In October of last year, the board was presented with a draft list of possible solutions. Again, went out for public review, 3 weeks minimum, and at that October 27th meeting, that was emailed out, and your board adopted that revised possible list with priority rankings in December of last year. And as a reminder, this is the priority ranking table that accompanied that board action. So moving forward now to this calendar year, and on January 28th, the board was presented with a list of possible solutions and then drafts of the advantages and disadvantages associated with each of the possible solutions. We released, your board directed us to release that document for a 3-week public review and comment period. We set the comment period at February 20th. You also directed us to not come back immediately at the February meeting to provide more time for a review and analysis, and that takes us to today. So we received 3 comment letters from Ventura Coastkeeper, Ventura Water, and Los Postos User Group. And I'm going to go through each of those in the following slides. So we did review each of those letters in considerable detail. An effort was made to incorporate many of the comments, suggestions, revisions that were presented, as appropriate, of course. And those are what you will see in your agenda packet today. So with the Coastkeeper letter, and again, we've provided you with a full copy of each of the comment letters that we received so that you can take a look at it yourself. You determine how the comments were addressed. Of course, the audience members or the representatives will probably do a much better job at explaining their comments, so I don't go into too much detail with each. But in general, for the Coastkeeper comments, they didn't specifically go to commenting on the specific advantages and disadvantages, but it was more on how the prioritization of the solutions should proceed. Similar, Ventura Water, they didn't provide specific revisions or comments on any of the advantages or disadvantages, but in general focusing on the prioritization of challenges rather than specific comments. Again, we provided a full copy of the letter for you to review in its entirety. So the Los Postos Users Group, they did provide extensive comments and a red line strikeout markup version for each of the advantages and disadvantages, or at least ones that they provided were felt important to them. I want to emphasize that we did consider and we have provided quite a few of the additions and changes, and that's item number 6E in your agenda packet. We also sent to you, Jessica sent the color version because we realized you may not be able to see the red line version very well, so hopefully that was a little helpful.
But it wasn't red?
You have a big print version.
Yes, we do. So some of the comments that they provided were global, such that they wanted a technical review committee, future stakeholder input, and we want to just acknowledge that, yeah, we recognize that there will be technical reviews, there will be many opportunities for stakeholder input. We didn't put that, just go to the next. Versus putting that in every single advantages and disadvantages, we just acknowledge it as a global comment. And that there would be multiple opportunities to flesh out through the public input process. So not to repeat it throughout the document. So other edits that included, there was some legal challenges. We felt that in many cases, any of the solutions can be legally challenged. So versus putting that on every single advantage and disadvantage, we didn't do so. And there was a few instances where we just didn't agree with the legal interpretation. And then there was some comments about county staffing, which we just didn't support because there was no evidence to support the inclusion. Comments were made about updating the document to reflect the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So we did that in some instances. In some instances, we did not. For example, the term safe yield. We included that. We had that with the beginning of the document a year ago, prior to the act actually being enacted by state legislature. We acknowledge that will be the term moving forward. We didn't felt it was necessary to change the whole document for consistency's sake. Excuse me. And we've, like the other comment letters, we've included the entire comment letter from LPUG for your consideration. There was an additional comment letter that LPUG submitted that was dated the 19th, but we received it on the 20th. In general, they expressed concern that not all of the proposed solutions, as listed in their November 17th letter, were considered or incorporated, or there was insufficient detail provided by the agency staff to evaluate those proposed solutions. So I just in general want to comment, and I've already outlined how long this process has been going. It's been stepwise, it's been transparent. There's been multiple opportunities for review and weigh-in, and we have, in all instances, carefully weighed the comments brought before us and for you for ratification in an open public meeting. So I want to move on to highlight just a few instances of some of the changes we made with the various categories. So replenishment fee, this is one that I brought at your January meeting.
Excuse me, before you get to the details on the changes, I'm new to this conversation.
Sure.
And as many times as I've read this, I don't understand how any of this moves us 1 inch closer to the development of sustainability plans. I read nothing in here that wasn't patently obvious and shouldn't have been patently obvious a year ago. Nothing in here that tells me any, for example, whether it's hydrology or safe yield, nothing that tells me anything about the nature of the available information, the utility of the available information, shortcomings in of the available information, or whether new information is needed at all. What exactly is the point of such a generalized, position statement? It doesn't seem to me to accomplish anything. Maybe you could describe for me what you intend me to learn from this.
I think it's better that I try to answer that question since Director Mulhart and I are the two that requested this.
Okay.
All right. We were doing emergency ordinance E, and what we were doing is we were trying to put in a temporary emergency measure because people felt like we needed to do something because of the drought and the overdraft problem, et cetera. We had a proposal in front of us that said we should make these cuts based on historical allocation and some cut back from that, et cetera. We had significant energy in the room and significant comment from people about two things. One, whatever process we were using or whatever allocation plan we were using, some people would say that was unfair, we hadn't considered this, that, et cetera. But probably more significantly was we are taking action without taking enough time to vet all the possible solutions, all the possible actions we could be taking, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages. There was huge outcry about process. And in recognition of the fact that at some point in time we're going to have to make some hard decisions, the idea was to give people an opportunity. They're saying, if we're getting ready to make some hard decisions, we have to find new supply. Yes, that wasn't the mission of the Groundwater Agency, by the way, when this started. The mission was only demand control. At the time. The state has now changed that with the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, but that being, we have to both control demand and try to provide additional supply. So to give everybody an opportunity, people said they had great ideas, they had this, they had that, et cetera. Say, okay, we're going to follow up every month. We're going to take one step of the process. First, identify, possible ways, and if you look at those letters, you will see all the steps in the process. And a big one was, what are the possible solutions to the problem? If we are in overdraft, which everybody agrees that we are, what are the possible ways that we can cut back? And then what are the different advantages and disadvantages? So that when we start to take action, we don't have everybody making the same argument that we shouldn't take action. We shouldn't do that because we haven't considered something that somebody has. So this is an attempt to be a comprehensive, built over many months with lots of opportunity for people to have input with each thing. An example, the issue that you just brought up, should we have automatic meter reading, right? Well, rather than us at the time that we're debating that, have people say, well, we need 2 or 3 months to go back. And this was often said, well, we have all kinds of stakeholders. We need a lot of time to go back and check with all those stakeholders. Now that issue has been put out there. It has been sent to those stakeholders. And those stakeholders at least can't say we need many months to talk to our stakeholders and find out what kind of comments we want to make about that. So that was the intention. It not being here at the time, I think I can appreciate why you might say a lot of it is obvious, but it is part. It certainly felt like the necessary process because of the significant amount of comments about delay, because we haven't had a chance to vet this properly. So this is an attempt to try to decrease the request for delay when we finally decide to do so.
And I guess I understand the concern about process. My concern is usually performance. I don't see anything in here that helps with performance, because I don't think anything in here that addresses those concerns, because there's nothing in here that that proposes anything, that suggests anything at all, that provides enough information on a disaggregated basis so that any given basin knows what their options are, or what we might be considering as options for a particular basin. That's not here.
I think that in the introductory part of each one, before you get to the various options that are listed, it describes what will be done. This is just what we're going to take up as study. Mm-hmm. The one thing you will learn here is patience. In the 12 years or whatever it's been,
I've my wife's number. You can tell her that.
Whatever it's been on this board, 12 years or whatever, I have learned some patience. I came in very impatient. I went off the board. I came back after 4 years, and they were still working on amendments to the same ordinance that they had been working on when I left. So you will learn patience. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, I do want to emphasize, when you say, you're right, and nothing was intended to be in here for anybody to be able to make a decision. What was intended to be in here is then for us to say, of these things, what are we going to do first? And when we do it, we can say, as we begin that process, we can say, we gave everybody a chance to tell us what the advantages and disadvantages are of the flow meter system, or of relying on data from all the agencies versus doing our own new studies.
Except that's a good example. This says that's an option.
Right.
It doesn't tell me anything at all about the advantages or disadvantages of using that data, because it doesn't tell me about the existence, the adequacy, the timeliness of that data.
And that's the next step. We have gotten to this point. So now, when we do that, here's what likely would happen without this. As soon as you started to say, well, we need to figure out what's the data, right? And somebody proposes, well, why don't we use this? If it's something that somebody doesn't like, they'll say, oh, we need time to evaluate that.
And you don't think that'll happen anyway?
Oh, I think that we have a much greater response to say, you've had time to give us ideas. Certainly we're going to have, this is what we got a lot. We have a lot of creative ideas that you haven't given us a chance to share with you yet. That, if you had a creative idea and you didn't bring it up in this almost 12-month period, well, then we have something to say, we've been at this. And I would still say, if somebody's got something, you can add it. Well, you have a document where you can go back and look. That was the attempt. It is by itself not sufficient, but I believe it is necessary for us to actually move the process down the road. When we get ready to make the hard decisions, I think you'll find us saying, hey, that's what this process was for you to say that to us now rather than raising it now to try to delay. Because delay whenever there are hard decisions in a political process, delay is the most common, out for people.
And at the end of today's discussion, when Gerhard finishes and we finish our questions and comments, staff is hoping that we will adopt the list and direct them to bring back the final list next time so that after a year and a month, we'll be able to move on.
Yes.
You're going to learn patience.
It's not even a question of patience. I guess what I still don't understand is what's the point of this? Because, Director Bennett, with all due respect, I disagree that at any point in the process, particularly since this is so generalized, that if somebody comes and says, but wait, before you consider using United's Basin Management Plan, you should realize that there's a hole in that plan with respect to some subject or another. Now, there's nothing in here that would justify us saying, well, you had your chance.
When we get down to the details, though, we'll be doing each one of these in more detail.
Yes.
When we get down, this is just...
And again, the point is, then what's the point of a glimpse into the obvious?
Well, your question should have been asked a year ago.
year.
Okay, let's move on,
Yes.
and let's have all our comments going through the chair, please.
Okay, so just a few examples, and then I'm going to actually hopefully tell you some next steps and why we, the staff, will make this useful, or where we're going to take this. So this is one of the categories, the replenishment fee. This is an addition that we added based on LPUG comments. We agree, of course, that the fee, any replenishment fee, would have to go under a 218 process. Similarly, under A1, the basin hydrology groundwater flow regime, you can see we've included in red many additions that were suggested in terms of balancing out some of the advantages and disadvantages. And then lastly, this last example, land subsidence. This is where we incorporated some of the SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act information, and some of the definitions, and we included that as one of the advantages, and also acknowledged that the yields may be decrease of yields in some of the basins under that scenario. So let's get to that next step. So what's in progress? What are we working? So Director West, when you were talking earlier in your board comments, I actually had to help back a little bit because we're exactly doing the thing that you had asked us in your board comments in terms of mapping out the convergence of our annual work plan and our budget, taking this list, and it's been prioritized to a certain degree, maybe not fully yet, and also looking at the Groundwater Sustainable Management Act, and how do we get to a plan, and how you can map a timeline with resources and do all of that, and take this information that you're considering today. I will bring up another option for your board to consider. You may want to consider one more step in this process, which is choosing a preferred solution or preferred solutions. As you can see, there are many solutions, and so in many cases they are too numerous for us to embark on at all at one time. So having a prioritized potential solution list may be something that you want to consider. So in conclusion, we did revise the advantages and disadvantages based on submitted stakeholder comments. After hearing feedback from your board and the stakeholders today, we are asking that you actually do a final, that you consider adopting this list of possible solutions and the revised advantages and disadvantages today. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. I'm going to take a cue from what Lynn would do if he were here and put forth my comments first, and then I'll ask for any other questions and comments from board members. I agree that we have gone on with this list development plenty long enough. I know you said when you first started, Director Bennett, that it was going to take quite a long time, and I think that we have taken quite a long time and put a lot of effort into it. But I think at some point we have to get on with doing what it is we want to do. So I fully agree that we should, if we're going to make any changes, make them and then direct staff to come back at the next meeting with a special, with a final list, which we would adopt as the final list. I also think that when we develop our plan of action, we need to go with the priorities, and maybe what we need to do is there are 4 very high priorities and 12 high priorities, which is in itself a lot of things to try to tackle. But I think that we need to try to tackle the higher priority things first. And maybe before we go through, if we were to go through and try to select options, we would only do it on those, because I think before we get to the low priority things and a lot of the medium priority things, circumstances could have changed again, and we may have some other technology might have changed, and we may have some other things that we could look at that came up in the meantime. So I would suggest that we try going by priority through these things when we start trying to find some solutions to our problems or our challenges, and that we start with the 4 very high and work our way down through the high and so forth. And we may have to, with the 12 high priority items, try to figure out which ones of those we want to tackle, because I think 12 are a lot to tackle at once. So having said all of that, I will now ask for other suggestions, comments, or questions.
I'd kind of
Yes?
like to hear some comments from anyone in the audience that they might have.
Okay. Are there no other questions, right? Okay. I'll now take comments from those in the audience. I think they'd like to hear your comments, Mr. Morchard. Then they're all going to come up. Okay.
I'll make a comment.
Good.
Mike Solomon, General Manager, United Water Conservation District. First of all, I agree with Director Bennett's comments. Director West, what's happened with the GMA for 34 years is delay. Smoke and mirrors, stopping the process. We wanted to get these answers so we could say, stop the madness, let's be leaders, let's take decisions. So I agree totally with that. We got to get this stuff out of the way. I also would comment, Ms. Craven, that things have changed. When this all started, this was last January, right. New legislation has come out giving you an awful lot of authority that says you don't have to beg or plead, or it's your job to get something done, to lead. So my comment to you is, let's not confuse patience anymore with leadership. We have been patient because we've just been beaten to death with one. Let's look at it over and over and over again. It's time to stop. We've got the answers. Let's move. Let's get this over with. Let's get to the GSA and the GSP and move it before 2020. Let's get something done. Otherwise, we're going to muddle with this forever and ever and ever, because there's always going to be somebody that's going to want to muddle it up to stop it. Let's start taking leadership role and get it done. That's what you're responsible for, and it's what United's responsible for, and we're ready to help you with it.
Any other comments?
Good afternoon, Rob Saperstein for City of Oxnard. 2 brief comments. Money. So, excuse me, there is no way that even the highest priority items can be tackled with a $4 per acre foot or $6 per acre foot assessment that the GMA currently has. So it would be nice to have, along with whether it's just the highest priority in some portion of the next priority set of items, a budget that goes with it, and convert that budget into what does that mean in terms of replenishment assessment. So have that as part of the next presentation to the board. And the other is some of the highest priority action items are dependent on United's groundwater model. And I understand that model may be slowed down, its capability. So I know it's not the subject of this agenda item, but it would be nice to get an update on where we are with that model And what's the alternative if that model isn't going to be available to deal with the high priority and extremely high priority objectives, I think, that are outlined in staff's plan. Staff's plan is comprehensive, though. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Here comes the update.
Good afternoon, Directors, Chair. Tony Morgan with United Water Conservation District. The groundwater model is still in progress, working diligently on it. The current timeline is end of the fiscal year to have something functional for the Oxnard Plain, Pleasant Valley, Forebay general area. So this is a model that's significantly more complicated than anything this county's ever attempted. It's 2 orders of magnitude more complicated than what Orange County uses to characterize their basins. And that complication is due in part to some of the management questions that this agency and our own district board of directors have asked staff to be prepared to help them with technical information as they make policy down the road. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. Anything else I can help you with?
Any questions?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else? Okay.
So I'd like to, I think it is hard when you have a process that's gone on for many months to sort of keep track of what you're doing, why you're doing it, et cetera. There's that old line, sometimes you have to move slow to move fast. That's certainly how it felt in this room when virtually every person said we were moving too fast with Emergency Ordinance E. And yet that took us over 2 months to do that. Now we weren't talking about what to do with credits, what to do with irrigation allowance, we weren't talking about any of those things, right? And so if that took months, at least 2 months and probably 3, then for us to take 12 months to say, tell us your opinion about getting rid of credits, or tell us your opinion, is there another way to deal with credits? We felt, and I believe almost everybody said, we want to have some input as you get ready to consider solutions. So I'm just going to read to you from the credits section. So under credits, the question was, basically what we wanted was, what are the problems, what are the possible solutions, what are the advantages and disadvantages of those solutions? Now, admittedly, we could have done that a lot faster than a year, but we couldn't do it and give every agency the opportunity to take that back. So we said, what are the problems? You tell us what you think the problems are, or staff will tell us what we think the problems are, right? And then what are the possible solutions to that problem? You tell us what you think, and we go back. That I believe was, given where we were at the end of Ordinance E, that was the appropriate step so that people wouldn't sit there and say, you're hiding the ball, or staff is just coming up with all this stuff and then just springing it on us, right? But we took months just to get Ordinance E done. So if you look at credits, the potential solutions, what do we do with credits? One, maintain the existing program. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages of that? Everybody in the water business has at least had a fair opportunity to tell us what they think about maintaining the existing program. Discontinue the program, eliminate all the accumulated credits. Believe me, if we had a hearing right now and we said, hey, we want to eliminate credits, right? We would have a long hearing right now, and many people, if we just put that on the agenda, right? Or if we even said next month we're going to cover this, right? We'd have all kinds of people say, that's not enough time for us to consider this. That ability to say that, we are saying, look, that is a possibility that this agency is considering, right? And we want you to tell us in writing what you think of that possibility. Now, not very many people take advantage of it. That's human nature also. But it at least has been done. How about sunset accumulated credits over a period of time? It's a possible solution. It's one that this agency has said, keep it on the list. We'd like to hear what you think about that, the advantages and disadvantages, right? And credits on the account remain viable, but you don't have any more new credits. Again, a possible solution with the credit programs, what you think of it. None of this gives us enough information to make a decision, but it does answer the question, has everybody been duly notified that it is a possible solution? Because many people will come up here and say, this is absolutely essential to my livelihood. And if it's absolutely essential to their livelihood, you want to be fair with the process. You want to say, great, we want to give you an opportunity to tell us this was at least a good faith attempt to try to do that. It does not mean that when we pick one of these things on credits, we still won't have people saying we need more time. But that argument will not have the same powerful effect that it had in the room the day we did that. I hope that helps explain why we did it. Credits is one. I mean, some of these things are more esoteric. Credits is certainly not esoteric. Very clear, hard issue that we have not done much with. And people are saying, most people say it's out of control, but what's the solution? We're going to have to deal with that hard thing. Now we can move, I hope, faster to actually do something. Thank you.
Robert?
I think we need to have a workshop. And the workshop isn't so much to tackle the very high and come up with a preferred solution, because there are policy decisions this board needs to make in order for staff and for the technical people in order to figure out what is the preferred solution. Case in point, seawater intrusion. That's the most glaring one we need to make a decision on here at the board.
It's not
Do you
even
want to
very
hold
high.
it as to where it's at? Do you want to push it back out in the ocean? Do you want it to come in another 150 or 300 feet? Because that drives what is the resource that's necessary in order to accomplish that. That is something that has to be done before you can go through and do a preferred solution. This board needs to sit down and have a workshop in order to convey those ideas and provide direction to the technical people out there so that they can go to their next step. I'm still curious, though, and I thank you for your input on this, trying to tie how this will fit into basin management plans. Because this document and what it provides and what it's going to be in each and every basin may look very different. Case in point, and I'm going to go out there, on credits, we realize that with the Oxnard Plain being an overdraft the way it is, credits probably are not savable. Probably not. They might have some life up in Las Posas being a different thing, but there are a lot of different things on here that are just not viable to get in compliance with the GSP, the plans that we have to put together. I think there's a lot of these things that we can absolutely just line out at this time as not feasible. We're not going to be able to do it given the time frame that it is. And we may need to write those off as casualties of the groundwater sustainable plan that we have to put in place. But I think there's some homework to be done with this board before we can go much farther. Staff has taken this as far as they can. We have questions we have to answer.
I agree with you that we're going to have a workshop. We had reserved for some Fridays for special meetings, and we've had some. In fact, that April meeting on April 11th was one of those special meetings, if you remember, where we first started to list all the things, and we've had several more. So I agree. I think at this point we're going to have some special meetings to wade all through this, because we have other business at our regular meetings, and it's going to be very difficult to attack some of these at the regular meeting times.
I'm ready to move. I've been ready to move for a long time in terms of this stuff. I believe we engage in this so that when we do move, we feel like we have some credibility as we move. So I'm ready to move. I think staff has actually done a very good job of trying to create some kind of format, some kind of structure for what we put out there in terms of doing that. I think the best way for us to move is to ask our staff to come back at our next meeting with their recommendations, because they just got comments back from agencies and they've put those in. LPUG probably has been one of the most consistent commenters, in this. But they just got those. They just put this together. Usually, I think a body like this does best when staff comes up with, this is what we think, and then we set policy, but we start with something that is created by people that are just have one mission, and that is to try to come up with what they think is good policy. So I appreciate your comments, but hearing that as sort of where you stand is that we come with staff giving us the recommendation about how do we pull this together and how do we start taking the next steps, given the fact that, part of that would be the response. What's the time frame for getting the groundwater sustainability plan? That did not exist when we started this process. So now how do we combine the work that we have to do on the groundwater sustainability plan with these possible solutions that have been identified here? Credits, as a classic example, this doesn't answer the question what to do with credits. Maybe credits need to be handled differently in different areas, right? But at least the question can be raised, right?
It's in here.
Exactly. Yeah, but at least the question now can be raised. So that's what I would recommend to move us forward, is have staff take the next 3 weeks, and then it's out there for a week for everybody to review it, and we have their input in terms of going forward. So we can go forward. If we just have a workshop without any recommendation, we're going to come up with 5 different directions, and that's always a little hard to try to corral in that kind of workshop.
And we'll have an additional one next time, because I assume Lynn will be here.
Okay. 6 different directions, right?
Brian, did you have a comment? I didn't mean to cut you off. Maybe I didn't see you coming forward. I'm sorry.
That was a good discussion. Brian Bondy, Groundwater Manager, Cayugas. Thank you for raising credits as an example. It reminded me that one of the comments that LPUG provided, and Cayugas put our comments in with the LPUG process as opposed to sending a separate comment letter, was that just a reminder that there's a very important legal distinction between conservation and storage credits that we felt isn't really being highlighted the way this program is laid out. It's sort of lumping all credits together. Our suggestion was to split the credits into 2 parts, one for storage, one for conservation, to make that very clear so that there's no question as to what type of policy is being discussed or considered for the different types of credits. That was one issue that staff did not decide to carry forward in how they brought the comments forward. So we just wanted to reiterate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And we would acknowledge conservation credits are a different subject matter versus in lieu credits versus storage credits. And any policy decision should be based on the distinction and the uniqueness of those credit programs.
Okay, other
Director West.
No,
David?
a little premature yet.
Well, I'll make that as the motion then, just to move this so we can get on the other items, and that is direct staff to come back with recommended steps in terms of moving forward and sort of the finalization of this document and the recommended steps for us to move forward.
So just clear, we are at the final step in this process, and you're providing us direction to come at the next meeting with recommendations.
Right.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
Clarification, please. In that list of recommendations, are you talking about it? In that list of recommendations that staff will be bringing back, are you going to be going through and checking off preferred potential solutions, or would a recommendation be to hold a workshop and you're going to tackle these topics or discuss these topics what would be the recommendation, or frame it?
If I knew what the recommendation was, I would make that the recommendation. I don't know what their recommendation may be working, but I don't know what the recommendation. I've had no conversation with them about it. I don't know what the recommendation would be. I would just simply say this: what we're asking staff to do is to try to marry the work that we have to do as a groundwater sustainability agencies now in terms of the plan, and the work that we have been doing that we started before we were that. Marry those 2 efforts together, and what does staff think is a roadmap for going forward. Not very different than what Director West was just asking for. It just acknowledges that this is one part of the data that's been collected at that point in time. But I mean, I don't think we could say, hey, staff, you should, now this is what you do. That's what we're asking them to do. Come up with a recommendation for us. Certainly, you've expressed what you think should be in that recommendation. I'm not expressing anything in the recommendation. Director West suggested some things that he's looking for in a recommendation, but that would be part of that. Okay.
I understand.
Okay, now is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Is there discussion on the motion? Okay, let's have a roll call on this one.
Chair Craven?
Yes.
Director Iranio?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director West?
Yes.
Director Borchert?
Yes.
Okay, we're moving right along. Item number 7, proposed resolution number 2015-2, a resolution establishing reporting requirements for approving Irrigation efficiency by operators who supply groundwater to non-well operator agricultural users. Could we have the staff report, please?
Good afternoon, Chair Craven and directors. Thank you for introducing my item. For the record, I'm Rick Viergoots. I'll be presenting today's item. So, a little bit on background. As you know, the emergency ordinance requires that all agricultural operators use the irrigation allowance index to achieve the efficiency allocation. We know that it's not efficiency per se, but the ordinance code has that language embedded in it, so you may see that terminology until that's changed. But the bottom line is all agricultural operators now have to use the irrigation allowance index. For many, the process is new, and for water suppliers, for agricultural water suppliers, additional effort will be involved. So within the agency's boundaries, there are mutual water companies, special districts, and others that provide agricultural water to growers. Some examples, mutuals, of course, are Del Norte, Zone Mutual Water Company, Barrelwood Heights. Special districts include Pleasant Valley, United, the County Waterworks District. All of the above are agricultural water suppliers for the purpose of today's discussion. These suppliers have customers or shareholders, depending on the nature of their agreements. And these customers or shareholders may or may not have their own well. So what we're going to talk about today is how that relationship regarding the irrigation allowance index is handled, whether or not these growers have their own well, and what would be required of the water supplier. So I'm going to talk about what we refer to as the primary well operator. So if a customer or a shareholder also has a well, they're also a well operator within the GMA, they're considered a primary well operator for this process. And staff's recommendation is that the primary well operators complete the irrigation allowance index reporting. That makes the most sense. If a surcharge were assessed, it would be assessed against the primary well operator. If the surcharge were at a value, higher value in acre feet extracted, higher than what the primary well operator account extracted, then the additional surcharge would be assessed against the agricultural water supplier. We had some brief discussions. Can't you just, if it's over, can't you just assess it against the primary well operator? And the decision was that no, right now we don't have the authority. So if a surcharge would be assessed, initially it would go to the primary well operator. If it was very high, it could then also include extractions by the agricultural water supplier. Okay. If the customer or shareholder is a grower but not a well operator, they don't report to the GMA, they're a non-well operator. They're a grower that's a non-well operator. In those cases, that grower receives the water from the water supplier. That's just how it works. They don't have a well, they get water from the water supplier, but that grower doesn't have a reporting relationship with the GMA. The water supplier does. And so the recommendation is that the water supplier files the irrigation allowance index paperwork on behalf of that grower. It'll require the water supplier to get information from that grower, which would include crops, acres, that type of information. And just some other considerations. Right now, aggregate reporting is accepted in the agency. So one of the things that will happen as agricultural water suppliers move forward into conducting or into reporting the irrigation allowance index, we'll see more aggregation of crops. And your board hasn't set any policies on that, whether there should be an upper limit or a lower limit for that matter. Complete irrigation allowance reporting has always required all sources of water to be reported. And so in the future, if surcharges are assessed, it will be important to be able to disaggregate what water was subject to surcharge and what water is not. And so that will ultimately result in some additional record keeping and potentially reporting. And in conclusion, staff's recommendation is that you adopt Resolution 2015-02, setting forth the reporting requirements for water suppliers under the Irrigation Allowance Index program.
Any questions?
How is that information being gathered now, if at all?
Well, some water suppliers, and I saw Carol here, some water suppliers are already collecting that information. Del Norte does, I believe. Zone does. Because they're aware of this change, and some of them, even before the emergency ordinance was adopted, were filing under the Irrigation Allowance Program. But for some, this will be new, and they'll have to start collecting that information.
Any other questions?
Actually, I have a question. Carol, is it a difficult process to collect that information for you? Sorry.
Carol Schoen, Zone Mutual Water Company, Burlwood Heights Mutual Water Company. We knew this was coming and sent out a questionnaire on this already to all of our shareholders in both companies and have received the information back from almost everyone. And we've taken that information and actually put it on their monthly meter read sheet so that they know how much IAI they're allowed and where they are so far for the year. And that way it's fairly easy to keep an eye on every individual. And we've done irrigation efficiency reporting in the past, so our spreadsheets do that. We can roll up our crops with no problem once it's all laid out. It was very time consuming, of course, to get this all in place, but it's in place now. And in addition, the mutuals, a couple of the mutuals, certainly not, I'm not speaking for all mutuals, have put in place a penalty program so that if within their organizations they have a customer that is exceeding their IAI, they've got a penalty structure in place already to protect themselves, because you can see that with the adoption of this, if it's going to come back on the company needs to have been protected. So that's where we are with it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, is there anyone who'd like to speak to us on this?
Good afternoon, Chair Craven and members of the board. My name is Robert Kwong with the A to Z law firm for the Pleasant Valley County Water District. First of all, I'm here because John Matthews is called away to another matter, and I wanted to take this moment and amplify a few points that we made in a comment letter dated March 23rd to your board. And let me just start off by saying it's our recommendation that this resolution not be passed by your board for the following reasons. Number one, first and foremost, this resolution does not merely identify or specify details to be included in a report filed by an operator for an AEA as authorized by the Ordinance Code Section 56122. This resolution actually assigns responsibility to specific agricultural operators and other entities, as already identified in the PowerPoint, involved in the supply and distribution of water for agricultural use for calculating that IAI and filing the AEA. So what we have here is that this resolution seeks to do something that by your very governing statute should be done by ordinance. And that's one of our main concerns, and that's highlighted on page 3 of that comment letter that I was reading from. Secondly, we feel that there are several terms in the board letter as well as the resolution that need further definition. And this is a very fundamental thing about writing regulations and guidance to regulated entities, is to get our terms straight and to get these definitions right. Just looking down at the staff report as well as the resolution, there are 9 terms that are not well defined in our mind. Terms such as shareholders, customers, primary well operator, mutual water company, special district, other ag water supplier well operator, grower, non-well operator, and agricultural water supplier. The PowerPoint was attempting to do that by grouping these terms and then identifying what these terms meant in terms of a mutual water company or a special district. But if in fact the resolution is going to be the guiding document and that which is going to govern the activities of these entities, those terms ought to be well defined within the resolution or, in our mind, actually an ordinance. So those are two of the big points that we wanted to make there in our letter, which I gave copies to the clerk for distribution. And wanted to emphasize again that Pleasant Valley, through its the law firm A to Z, we are open to working with your staff, as always, in coming to practical solutions in determining how best to regulate this crucial area of groundwater management.
Mr. Kwong?
Any
can I
questions?
ask a
Yeah.
question?
Yes.
Is it fair to characterize as the two items that you brought up in your testimony here today are process items? You think this should be done by ordinance rather than by resolution, and we should identify our terms. Is that correct?
It is both process and substance, because the process is going to lead to a place where we can have the input, which we've already identified in the previous matter, but also the substance within the regulation.
So that's the second part of my question. If the process issues, the concept of having the water supplier be responsible where the person is the concept one that your organization that you represent supports or doesn't support?
I think to answer that question, I refer to the actual board letter itself on page 2 of 3 under the subsection Assessment of Surcharges for Primary Well Operators. In that first paragraph, it identifies the ideal situation, which staff has already identified. Ideally, these surcharges would go to the primary well operator in all circumstances. And then it says very clearly there, however, current agency authorities do not provide for that. If current agency authorities don't provide for what is the preferred way of going about doing that, there is a way to solve that. That's by regulation, and that's by ordinance. And then it says in the following sentence, for now, the agency would separately assess the surcharge. Once you use words such as for now, then where do we see the end of this? There's no end time to the way that this preferred way of calculating is going to happen. If it is only a for now situation or a temporary solution, then let's identify the time frame that we're talking about here. So it is a process, Supervisor Bennett, but it's also a substance matter.
Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak to us?
Carol Schoen, Zone Mutual Water Company, Burlwood Heights Mutual Water Company. You know, I'm going to give a little history on this resolution. You may be aware, you may not be aware. But it came before the board a number of months ago on one single sheet of paper, and the wording was incorrect. And at that point in time, Director Borchert objected to last-minute switcheroos and getting language fed that didn't get, I guess, totally passed out to everybody, and the whole process got delayed. Well, a group of us took the time to write a 5-page resolution, including a lot of input from John Matthews and Robert Krimmer to address all of the different possible scenarios that could come up for a special district. We had a great deal of definition on who is responsible for what. We sent it in. It got stripped down, and now we're back to 2 pages where it's missing all of the definitions. So I can understand the frustration on PV's part because they spent the time to try to fully define how the reporting would be. Now, I think what is before you today covers the needs of a mutual. What we were asking for in the beginning, can we still file in the aggregate the way we have? And that's what we're getting very close to filing time, and this thing is dragging on and on and on. But I can understand where PV is coming from because they're different. There's United mixed in with it, and they had spent the time and a whole lot of effort. It's circulated through a number of different offices and different people spending the time on it to write the whole thing up and get it in, and then we get it back. We asked for meetings on the subject, whatever we could do. If they had problems with any bit of it, let us come in. Can we work through it? Just as Robert was suggesting, that we're open for meetings and discussion on all of it. So, I don't know. I mean, I think it answers what mutuals need to do, but it certainly is not a complete document to tell people who's responsible for what. It just isn't. Everything got stripped out of it again, and I don't know why. So that's my comment.
Okay, thank you.
Can we ask staff if anybody can answer the question as to why the language was modified from what they came up with? Is that council or is that staff?
I did review the 5-page version and determined that it included a lot of provisions that were either unnecessary or just contrary to the ordinance code itself, and recommended to staff that they go with a simplified version, which I think is adequate, because this is only addressing reporting requirements for operators that are supplying groundwater to others. This is not imposing surcharges on anybody. This is just so we avoid a gap in the reporting, that this makes somebody responsible, whether it's the primary well operator or a water supplier as described in the resolution. And that was the sole intent of this.
Did staff get back to the people that submitted the 5-page report about the fact that there was a change and why?
Staff did email it back. We emailed it to Carol and explained just generally, she could see clearly that it had been cut down. And we received feedback from Carol that she thought it would probably work, but clearly she's got some concerns about people that are not mutuals. But that wasn't made clear to us at the time.
Okay.
And I didn't get to ask Carol while she was up here, but from your perspective, there's a need to get an answer because you're getting close to reporting time. Was that correct?
Yes, Director Bennett, we're all getting close to reporting time.
Right, so
on TV, everybody.
Yeah, so you have, right.
So the clarity on what it is we're going to need to produce, I think it's important. And, I do know that the draft that I had from you, Rick, was slightly different than what's in the packet. And that there were concerns last Friday from, John Matthews and Bob Krimmer over how it's been skinned down, and then I directed them to call county council. And I don't know the outcome of that. I never spoke to them after that.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another speaker here.
Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Dave Sasek from the Ventura County Waterworks. And listening to what was briefed today just raised a couple of concerns. One is we get our groundwater allocations in the aggregate, and yet it sounded like we might be held accountable for a ratepayer that we provide water to that might exceed their IAI. And that maybe I misunderstood what was briefed today, but that concerns me because, again, we get a total amount of water that we can serve, and if we don't exceed that number, yet one of our ratepayers does, it sounded like there's a way that penalty will find its way to us and the rest of our ratepayers. So unless I misunderstood what was said, I think that just bears some clarification before we move forward.
Okay, Rick?
I think that the question's pretty simple to answer. So what Dave Sasek was referring to is they may report for multiple customers. And in that case, they would report one single IAI application to the GMA. if one of their individual customers, had they been looked at specifically, had they been over the IAI, the GMA wouldn't see that. We wouldn't see it. We would only see it if, in the aggregate, the Waterworks District was over the IAI for all of its customers. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Carol Schoenigan, you know, that's true, Rick, unless he is serving water to somebody that has a well, and the well is the primary owner and included in, then he falls into the same thing that the rest of us do. And when we look at that to say, how do we know what a primary well operator's doing when we're supplying water? There's no way that should come back anywhere other than to that operator. It shouldn't come back on a mutual, it shouldn't come back on the county, it shouldn't come back on PV. There's no way that that should happen. So Dave's correct in being concerned about that.
Carol, while you're up, do you see any problem if we delay this another month?
No, I don't, but I would really request that we sit and hash it out ahead of time so that we know what we're going to be presented rather than having it be the Friday before the meeting. So, thank you.
You know, if I could just briefly, Carol's concern is palpable, and I think for good reason. But I'm appreciative of the letter we received last minute here from the law firm, from John Matthews. And the reason for that is I think we all have that up front here with us. This is page 5. At the bottom of this letter, it finally describes for me what I've always had a question about. And it exemplifies PV's situation that, for example, doesn't exist in zone. And it's the fact that they describe the very last bullet point. Well, it's the series of the 3 last bullet points there, where they describe how PV will supply their own well water extractions in addition to perhaps some well water from United to a mutual. And then that mutual will supply that blend of water, perhaps with their own well water. So there are now 3 well waters in the mix going to the grower. And the question they pose here is, so who makes that report? It's a really valid question. And it's something that's, well, and more importantly, who makes a report right now? And these folks are trying to make the reports, and I agree, the resolution doesn't make that clear. So I would move that we push this off and that we direct county council, perhaps, to work with the parties involved here, and let's get this resolved and bring it back to us ASAP.
I'll second that and add, I think this is one more reason why using IAI in the long run in the future as a baseline poses some significant problems for us.
I don't know if that has anything to do with IAI. It has to do with the concept of who's going to make the report.
Because you use IAI.
No matter what allocation scheme it was, who makes the report? In this situation, it's not clear.
Okay, we have a motion to bring this back at the next meeting. Is that was?
If they can.
Correct.
Okay. And we had a second.
A motion to bring it back to the next meeting, and that county council and the parties involved would hash this out and bring us something we can vote on.
Okay. Is there any objection? So ordered. Item number 8, groundwater. Well, let's see here. I need to go back just a second because during the roll call I failed to note the alternates who are in the audience. Andy Waters, Neil Andrews, and Dave Schwabauer, for the record. Okay, now, item number 8, groundwater level status report.
Good afternoon, Chairman Craven and directors. I'm here to present item 8, groundwater level status update. And this update comes in the form of a potentiometric surface map, and color versions were included in your agenda packet so that if you wish to look at those during this presentation. Going back, this is the update is in the form of a potentiometric surface map for both the upper aquifer system and the lower aquifer system. This is a continuation of the process of producing potentiometric surface maps that began in October, December 2013 when we worked on the 1972 to 2012 potentiometric surface maps. Those were for even years. And then last year we presented to you the 2013 potentiometric surface maps for both the upper and lower aquifer systems. So today I'm presenting the 2014 proposed potentiometric surface maps for your consideration. Going back here. The annual potentiometric surface maps are created for the fall. Therefore, there's a map for the upper aquifer system, the lower aquifer system, and they're created agency-wide so that you get a broad picture of what water levels are throughout the agency. The potentiometric surface maps reflect the interpretation of the groundwater and hydrologic conditions. They're based on the data that was provided by others. This includes the County of Ventura, United Water, Cayugas Municipal Water District, and other mutuals and other water agencies. And it is based on the available data at the time that the maps were generated. As I stated, it's a compilation of data, and it is wells extracting. For the upper aquifer system map, it is only those wells that are extracting from the upper aquifer system, so we don't have any blending. And for the lower aquifer system map, it is only those wells that are perforated and taking water from the lower aquifer system. Initial contouring is using a software package. And then the maps are, then they are adjusted manually. And these maps are consistent in areal extent, the display of the data collection points, the contour intervals, and the geographic reference information. It was taken to the Operations Committee at that time, back in 2013. The Operations Committee directed us to put a disclaimer on the map, so you will notice the maps do have disclaimers on them. There's certain information that they requested be shown, such as the cities and the roads, that the maps be stamped draft until they are received and filed by the board, and that the maps be reviewed by a technical group. And that was done. It was sent out for review, and we did receive feedback from Cayugas Municipal Water District and also from United Water. So this is an example of the maps. You can see the contour intervals, 20-foot contours, the color scheme. Everything that is green to blues, those shades are above sea level. Yellows, oranges, red indicate water levels that are below sea level. Our data points are indicated with black dots with the measurement beside the black dot. The BMO monitoring wells are noted with a circle with a cross in the middle and identified by the name of the BMO well ID. We also, there's our disclaimer, and then it identifies what the map is for. This particular one was fall of 1972. So moving forward, here is the upper aquifer system map for fall of 2014. Note we continued the draft stamp, and you can see that water levels are declining well below sea level in the Oxnard Plain, along the eastern boundary of the Oxnard Plain and in the Camarillo area. The only water levels are showing here as above sea level are up in the Forebay region. So a comparison of the 2014 map to that of the 1972 map. That's 10 years before the agency was established, just so you can get some context. And then moving forward, 1990 is selected because that was a drought year and it shows very low water levels within the agency. So you can see the difference between 2014 and the 1990 water levels at approximately the same locations. Our interpretation based on the data available. So then running through, 2010 was the last year in which we had above average rainfall. So going forward, looking at conditions since the drought began, the current drought. So that's 2010. Those are water levels in 2012. And you'll note the blues where it was above sea level, and then 2013, and then currently fall of 2014, the most recent data.
Now, could you go back? Excuse me, could you go back and do that again? 2010, 12, 13, and 14.
So here we have 2010,
That's 10. Okay.
2012, 2013, and 2014. Based on input provided by Callegas, we put question marks up here because at present we don't have any well information water levels up in this stretch. So we've added the question marks because we don't know exactly what those water levels are.
Thank you.
So moving forward to the lower aquifer system maps, this is the 2014. And then putting it into context, 2014 versus where water levels were in 1972. You'll notice that water levels were much higher in the East Las Posas Basin than they are currently, but yet water levels in much of the other area were higher than they are currently. This is 1990 during the peak of the drought, last drought, and compared to 2014. And then going through looking at 2010 to 2014, so 10, whoops, that went fast. 2012, 2013, and then 2014.
And could you do that one more time again, please?
Sure. So 2010, 2012, 2013, 2014. And you'll notice if you compare 2013 to 2012, East Las Posas water levels were actually lower than they are in 2014. And the depression in the West Las Posas Basin was deeper in 2013 than it is in 2014. And just to note that Callegas Municipal Water District in their ASR field injected in April through about June, July, approximately a net of 3,400 acre feet of water was injected into the East Las Posas Basin. So our recommendations, thank you so much for hearing this presentation, and request your feedback and recommend that this report be received and filed. Any questions?
Questions? It's pretty clear. Okay, any comments? Is this an item anybody'd like to speak to us on?
I'll make a motion that we receive and file the report.
Is there a second? To receive and file?
I'll second.
Motion to receive and file. Any objection? So ordered.
Good report, and
Yes.
the visual, I think, is very helpful for people. So nice work with that. Thank you.
Okay, number 10 on the agenda is a closed session. Did we have the,
Sorry, don't have item 9?
oh, well, I was just going to ignore that, I guess. I don't know. I got to the bottom of the page and went to the top. Item number 9, second status report on implementation of Emergency Ordinance E, considerations of additional adjustments to the annual irrigation allowances, or the AIA. Could we have the staff report, please?
Yes, good afternoon, Chair Craven and directors. For the record, my name is Rick Virgutz. I'll be presenting today's item, number 9. So, we last talked to your board about this at the February board meeting. At that time, your board acknowledged that we didn't have a lot of information yet, and your board directed us to return today to provide an update on reported extractions and also water levels. Kathleen just discussed water levels, so we won't go into that. Your board also requested that the board letter invite stakeholders to provide input regarding ideas having to do with further reductions, so we've done that. So let me just jump right into the revised information. So I'll be presenting you some revised graphs today. Table 1 of the board letter describes that extractions in calendar year 2014 were slightly lower than 13. Agricultural extractions were about 1.7% lower. That's about 1,800 acre feet. And M&I extractions were about 3.4% lower, about 1,500 acre feet. And reduced allocations were not in effect for ag for the entire year.
Given the reduced allocations, what did we hope, what was our goal in terms of what we were trying to accomplish? What were we looking for in terms of numbers?
I have some graphs. I'll show those to you.
Thank you. That'll be fine.
If we could wait, it'll make more sense. So we also told your board that in February, we'd be working very hard to contact late reporters and non-reporters. We did that. The overall compliance is approximately 90%. Now let me move on to the data. Director Bennett, you asked about targets. You'll see these as these red boxes in the graphs. But quickly, the green line is the 10-year average for agricultural extractions. The red line is the target, the ultimate target, which is 63,700 acre feet. And the benefit of this graph over last time is last time we estimated this value. Today we have current information. Data is going to be kind of hard to see in this zone here, so I'm going to show you a graph where we zoom into that. And we are sort of, if you look at this as a timeline, we're here today, where this arrow comes down. In 2013, these were the reported extractions. In calendar year 2014, these are the reported extractions. Now, the target per the emergency ordinance says that starting, we have two targets. One of them started August 1st, 2014. And that's this target here. It's round numbers, 72,000 acre feet. And that target was started with the new 25% reduced irrigation allowances, which started during calendar year 2014. So we're about 2/3 of the way through this year. And then the crop year 15-16 target we will approach very soon. Briefly, to get from this peak down here would be a reduction of approximately 35,000 acre feet in extractions. And for the 15-16 year, if we were to use 2014 as our reference point, would be approximately 43,000 acre feet. So that's a reduction of 33% and 40% respectively from 2014. Agriculture, I will show you the agricultural graphs as well. These are set up the same. M&I extractions. So 10-year average is up here for M&I. This is the target. It's 36,000 acre feet. The target's supposed to be reached January 1, 2016, over here. We have good data for 2014 as well. So you can see that 2014 extractions were a little bit lower than 13. And to get from here to here, there will need to be a reduction of approximately 6,000 acre feet. And I'll go into that in the next slide. For M&I, their TEA actually started in, was effective for the whole, effective for half of the calendar year 14. And as we move forward, their targets come out here starting January 15 and January 16. And so, like agriculture, there will be more reductions that need to be made to meet this target. This would be about a 6,000 acre foot per year reduction, and the other is about 7,000 acre feet per year reduction. Relative to the TEA period, that's just shy of 20%. So in both cases, additional reductions will be needed to meet the targets that are upon us.
Could you go back one slide, please? So both with M&I and Ag, we didn't achieve the level of reductions that we wanted. But with M&I, they've had their allocations for the whole year. There wasn't a phased-in process and stuff.
Yeah, M&I is a little bit different than Ag because, as you could see with the agriculture, their reduction targets started later in the year. Mm-hmm. When we compute the M&I TEA using the TEA value for the second half of 2014 and half of its historic allocation for the first half of 2014, M&I did well meeting that goal. M&I did well meeting the 2014 goal. The reductions don't really kick into M&I until 15 and 16.
Okay. So we can't look at this and say there's penalties being collected for all this that is over just because of where we are. But eventually you could look at this, and if we're over, there would be penalties being collected?
Right. And currently there are some penalties being assessed for 2014 for some operators that did go over their allocation. Mm-hmm. But in the aggregate, they're pretty well on target for calendar year 14.
Thank you.
So, in conclusion, it's out there. We're requesting input from stakeholders on future next steps. The current reporting data indicate that a minor reduction in extractions did occur in 2014 relative to 13. Additional reductions will be needed to meet the targets. And we're here just seeking your board's direction and confirmation of its past direction, which would include returning in April with an additional update and other discussion items.
Any questions? Okay. Any questions?
Rick, have you received any feedback from stakeholders?
I haven't received any direct feedback, or Jessica, have we received anything on the GMA email account that's posted here? Have you checked?
No.
Okay.
And
the answer is no.
And the inquiry to stakeholders, is it simply what suggestions do you have with respect to reduced allocations, or has there been a request for feedback on specific types of allocation adjustments?
Well, it's a little bit of both. We're asking the question in general. If anybody has any specific ideas, we'd like to hear them. At the last board meeting, your board told us to work with stakeholders. It mentioned working with the growers group and talking about some specific issues about whether or not the irrigation allowance index could work to bring the extractions down. So there have been some discussions on that. Those are more specific discussions.
Director West, if I might, if I recall from last meeting, the extraction information wasn't real confident at that point. Staff was still wanting to get in the final numbers, and I think they've presented us with the majority of them. And so I think, if I recall correctly, the idea was to present those final numbers to us here. Also, stakeholders would have a chance to see those numbers, and then there would be a more intensified effort about what are we going to do about this.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Looking at the numbers and hearing from staff that additional cuts are going to have to be made.
Yes.
I question whether it's that we should make additional cuts to the IAI allowance. That just starts to, I don't have confidence that that's the best way for us to get there. And so I mentioned it at the last meeting, I'll mention it again, some new formula to create the allowance for everybody is one that I would consider exploring. And I've suggested just one, and that is potentially go with 1/3 historical allocation, the one that was based one third based on the last 5 years or something, and 1/3 based on the just the amount of acreage somebody has. That a whole lot of conversation would have to go into that, but something along that line would give us a fixed number that you could then say, okay, take that number, and then everybody's got to cut 30% from that number, and that's what they have. It feels to me more manageable than the IAI, where I don't know what IAI even translates into, because I don't know what that has. So that's from my standpoint in terms of feedback, that's something that if people were interested, if the board was interested in looking at that, I think that may be a way to go instead of IAI. And I'd love to have input on that if anybody has any in terms of that.
Okay, are there any comments from the public?
Director Craven?
Yes.
Andy Waters, Summer Mutual Water Company, LPUG Chair. Brief comments. I don't think you were here, but thanks for teeing that up, Director Bennett. LPUG has worked diligently on an extraction allocation program. We've met 8 times, I think. I briefed the board in public comment that we worked on a 20,000-foot level look at the allocation scheme, and we'd like to bring that to the April board meeting, maybe do a presentation at that time on our allocation scheme, and get that to your board a couple weeks before the meeting, too.
Are you able to share with us, is it an IAI allocation scheme or something
No, it's an
other
allocation
than
scheme that's based on the basin yield. It's far different from what we've been looking at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rob?
Rob Saperstein again for City of Oxnard. Sorry, Mike and I were having an important conversation about his job. But, a few different things, both the micro and then macro. For the City of Oxnard, we've been very mindful operationally about the T. It makes it easier for M&I folks because it's quantified. So to that extent, Director Bennett, you're correct in that it makes planning, although I have a macro comment about that, planning easier because the city knows exactly what it's got to work with, and it understands how the successive 5%, 10% impacts are going to hit the city's operation, and it's not going to go into penalties. So to the extent the city's a big part of those bar graphs, it won't be contributing to overuse of its T. And so it knows exactly what it has. It's got 1 or 2 requests into the GMA about making some subtle changes to that. But from a operational standpoint, I'm sure the other cities are doing the same thing. They know exactly what they've got, and they're making a mindful choice. Are they going to overpump and pay penalties or not? From a macro standpoint here, I'm watching all this, watching the last agenda item, and boy, I've been doing this for 20 years, and it's only now gotten painful, so maybe that tells you a little bit more about me than the process. Figuring this next step out, and by next step I mean the expectation of the emergency ordinance, and that it was a short time off ramp for long-term policy changes for the GMA, and we're getting nowhere fast on those issues, and it's tremendously difficult for the city in having to make 25-year projections on water supply reliability. Do we do it based on the emergency ordinance? Do we do it based on the existing ordinance that hasn't been retracted? It's just sat on ice for some period of time. It's getting very, very challenging to do those things. So whatever it is that the board can do to accelerate that process. There was mention of a operations committee meeting, and I don't remember ever seeing notice of a public operations committee meeting, but the GMA has committees. So if we need to be sending some of these things through the committee process, please do. As many meetings as necessary to move this along, because at least city's expectation was the emergency ordinance was temporary, and that we'd get to some of the proposals that are in the year-long workup that staff's done. We've identified all the issues. We've identified 99% of what the potential options are in dealing with them. What I worry about is those aren't going to get resolved in this setting. This is just too difficult a process, stepping up and down, making public comment, and making the sausage in front of it in a public setting like this, just way too slow. So, thank you.
Mike?
Mike Solomon, United Water. I actually agree with Rob on everything he just said. So, I think I am going to give a recommendation. Number one, it's really clear emergency ordinance is a total failure. We just saw we've gone nowhere. Last year we did an emergency ordinance. We're in worse shape now. We're still talking about something that's not working. The 4-bay is worse position it was right now than it was last year when we were doing emergency. So if that was an emergency, we have a super emergency now. And yet the last two items we talked about, we're still trying to figure out what does IAI mean, how are we going to calculate it, how do we report it. Let's drop this mess. Let's drop it. My recommendation, not so much go at like 30% reduction, because that benefits people that maybe wasted water. Not maybe waste, but used a lot more. I say this board, since we have a super emergency, let's look at doing something that's real clear. Ag, you get 1 acre-foot per acre until we either get out of this drought or we start creating projects through the GSP and we start getting water. Now, everybody will say, well, there's no livelihood. We can't make our life. We're running out of the resource, folks. There isn't the water there. Eventually, we're going to deplete. Your responsibility is not to make their livelihoods, but to protect that resource so future people have a livelihood. We're going to destroy this. At the rate we're going, we got to make decisions. We got to do it now. I would recommend 1 to 1.5 acre foot. If somebody can't grow a crop, then they can sell their acre foot to somebody else that wants to. Or they can, if they have surface water, they can use all the surface water they want and then sell their pumping rights. I would also say you take the surcharge and you move it up to $5,000, $10,000. It's got to be a penalty that says you are not going to abuse this resource anymore because it's a financial benefit to you to pay a $1,200, $1,400 penalty and just keep sucking it down. You just saw those maps. Since the start of the GMA, we're in worse shape than we were without the GMA. Come on, folks. If we were in an emergency situation last year, we're in a super emergency, and that means we can't be talking about this till June, July, and August. We're in worse shape now than we were. It's March. The east winds are out there blowing. It's going to be hot. Everybody's going to be watering like crazy over the next few months. Let's give a clear number right now. That's all you get. There's no, how do you calculate this? You get 1 acre foot per acre, 1.5, I don't care. But it can't be 3. It can't be 4. We're in trouble. Our responsibility, yours and United's, is to not let this get out of control and damage. Because we have got to start making more deposits than we're taking withdrawals. That means we've got to, when it rains, we can't go back to just pumping up. We got to let that water go back in the ground. So that would be my strong recommendation. Let's set a number. Let's set it next month. You have the authority as the GMA. Under the GSA, you have to have a GSP and go through all the process. But you are still the GMA. You have the authority to control pumping. Anybody wants to can sue you, but you have the authority. What are they going to sue you on? Doing what you're supposed to do? You still haven't met the state requirements that came out in 1982. We're in worse shape than we were before the GMA started. So what did we accomplish? Set a number that's easy to calculate, make the penalty hurt so bad that it is not even an incentive to try to do it, and then make it an open market. If somebody can't grow a crop of 1 acre foot, trees and stuff possibly can, but others may not. Sell your allocation to somebody else and let them grow a crop. There are people fallowing in Central Valley, 1 million acres. We're still out there planning and doing stuff. Let's get real. I know it hurts people's livelihood. It's going to hurt the livelihood worse if we deplete this resource to a point where we can never pay it back. And I, for one, am not ready to worry about how much I can make today and screw the kids for later. I think we have that responsibility. So take that for what you want a recommendation, that's a recommendation. IAI is not working. Director Borchard is not working. Nobody can even figure out how to calculate or who's responsible. And there's no way you can even file a penalty, because if you filed a penalty against me, I'd say, hell, I didn't even know how to report it till just last week. And I used the water last year. What are you going to get me for? You couldn't tell me how to report it. Let's get real and do our jobs.
Thank you. Jeanette?
Jeanette Lombardo, California Food and Agribusiness Advocates, and I have to respectfully disagree with Mr. Solomon. Mr. Bennett, Supervisor Bennett, excuse me, you've mentioned the last couple meetings you don't understand the irrigation allowance index. I would like for you to come and perhaps sit with the growers group and get an understanding of that. And you can understand why adjustments in it are working. We have only been in this process for 4 months, since August. We have already, that you've seen in reporting, we have already seen, and I would love to have Mike drive around with me, land being fallowed, leases being let go, crop patterns changing, and commodities leaving this area, particularly strawberries and vegetables. So to say you are an economics person, you get this. It needs time to work. We will see it working even more in August. But you cannot base this on 4 months. Additionally, I know Mike says we're in a super emergency, but by his own numbers, our water levels are better than they were when we even started the emergency ordinance.
Okay.
This
Each
is my
person
time.
was have their say.
Last point. I just came from the Central Valley last week. There is economic consequences. What we are doing is the right thing. I don't want to see a city like I have up there, where you have 3/4 of the town unemployed, waiting in line for food distribution, and there's not enough food, and they're fighting in line. We don't hear about this in the media, but it is happening. We can do this, and we can do it correctly. We have to manage it. And yes, you have 18 people who aren't reporting. And you're going to have people who don't understand the irrigation allowance index. And then maybe those people need to have individual discussions with staff or someone else. And if we can come up with a better method, I'm open to it. But I'm just saying, let's just not throw this out when it's actually starting to work.
Okay. This man over here, what came up next, and then Mike, and then Carol.
I'm Paul Diebischer, a property owner and grower out in the Oxnard Plain. Looking at the two things. Looking at M&I charts and the ag charts, one thing that you have to keep in mind is looking at T and the IAI. We don't have the option generally as ag producers to turn on a Kaigas outlet. So you look at the M&I and where they have to be, and they're not going to be paying surcharges because they have the option of imported water for now that is either at $1,100 or $1,300 an acre foot. If I had that option and I was up against my allocation, I would turn on my Kaigas outlet and use that water, but I don't have that. And then my second point regarding the overpumping and 1 acre, this thought of 1 to 1.5 acre feet per acre. Let's think real hard about extracting 20,000 acre feet and putting in this desalter plant where I am, out on the Oxnard Plain, because we're talking about lowering pumping, but United is proposing expansion of groundwater pumping by 20,000 acre feet a year. So I just want you to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike?
I apologize for the interruption, but I had just said to you that the data is showing that we're worse off than we were at this time. Clearly, the water levels are lower than when we did the emergency. The other thing I would remind the board, I'm not going to tell you, you look at the data, does that look like emergency ordinance is working? Are we getting there? I think it was Gerhardt, you just gave what said, we would just have to drop 34,000 acre feet just in the next few months just to get us to where we were supposed to be this. On the first year, then next year we got to do it all over plus some additional. We're so far in the hole, they can't possibly get there unless we literally put a clamp on it. The other thing to keep in mind as you're making this decision is Kaigas has already told, or Metropolitan has already said, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, Brian, they're going to cut back 20% this year. That means Oxnard's going to have less, Port Hueneme, cities are going to have to pump a little bit more just to get their water. The last thing I'll say to you is in the Central Valley, yeah, they have hardship. Have you also read that the ground is dropping an inch every month? Canals are breaking, pipes are breaking. That's what you get when you get subsidence, when you keep abusing and abusing and abusing the system. We've got to stop. We've got to stop the madness and get to work on the plans that bring more water in so we can be sustainable, so we can have farming. We cannot irrigate efficiently every crop around here. Some things we just can't afford the amount of water it takes to grow until we bring on new water. So we are worse off than we were last year when it was an emergency, so it's a worse emergency now, and we're starting a drier season. There's no snowpack. Cayugas and Met are going to drop at least 20%, reduce their allocations 20%. Where's that going to come from? Subsidence starts when you suck the thing down to dry, and we're seeing that in the Central Valley. It's time, folks. Emergency ordinance is not working, and it's not going to work. The penalties, I heard it from several people. It's cheaper to pay the penalties than to follow. Make the penalty $10,000. It says, do not use this, or you got a big deal to pay. Okay. Good luck,
Carol.
Carol Schoen, Zone Water, Burlwood Heights. I think it might be helpful if when we were looking at these numbers and the charts, we could look at them by the basins, because, you know, we're pointing at a map, but I'm looking at that East Las Posas, and it was this dark blue. So, you know, we don't want to all get swept in. That's just one thing I would ask, is that when we're looking at numbers, can we look at them by the basin areas? But the next thing I would like to say is that I believe looking at these charts, and Jeanette's correct, and looking at numbers that are only through the end of 2014, it's a little misleading. So Dave called me yesterday, and I thought I would just pull some numbers from Zone. Just, you know, we're a pretty large pumper out there. So from August, when Emergency Ordinance E started, until February, which is the last month, when that's the only information I've got, we've pumped 2,923 acre-feet. Last year in this same time frame, we pumped 3,900 acre-feet. So we have almost 1,000 acre-feet less pumping this time frame than last time frame. What I would like to say is, don't say Emergency Ordinance E isn't working yet. We listen to all of the growers, come before this board and ask for some kind of certainty in the leases that they had in place and the plants that they had ordered and all the rest of it. It seems to me that we ought to at least see this through a full cycle and not make a decision on just very short run of data. So I'm seeing a difference in my area. I'm seeing a lot of fallow ground. Whether it's going to get replanted or not as quickly as it normally would have, I don't know. But I hesitate to say that we should throw this all out in the next meeting. I'd like to say that we would provide the certainty to those growers that we said with the way we put the emergency in place, and let's let the whole thing run the first cycle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rob, and then I'll only take new comments from new people because we have to move on to our closed session too after we finish this item. Rob.
Rob Saperstein for City of Oxnard. I always learned long ago in my marriage, allow my wife to have the last word. So that's not my intention here. This is just a real example, real practical example of why this setting will not work to develop good policy to move this agency forward. We'll hear hyperbole, we'll hear drama. We need some stakeholder meetings that are a little more informal settings so people can vent and then get practical. And I know Mike is very frustrated. I understand it. But all we get is little sound bites here, and it's not effective to develop the policy. I think that Director Bennett, Director Mullard, the whole board tried to set this plan forward, and the gods blessed us to give us Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that actually potentially accelerates some long-term planning and tools for the agency. It's not going to happen in this setting. So please, if it's as part of staff's proposal for next month and how to work on the priority items, included in that, I hope would be some both budget and process that takes us out of these board meetings to try to get all those things done. Thank you.
Okay. So we're asked to give staff some direction. What is our direction to staff?
You got another speaker?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. David Schwabauer, just a comment. I respect Mr. Solomon's opinion. I think it's important to hear people's opinion. Everybody in the room has a right to be heard, and I think that's very important. I think Carol made some very good points, though, and one that I just want to reiterate. And I know it's one that's a bit of a challenge for this organization because for so many years we've looked at everything from a big picture point of view and looked at everything as one bathtub. But I think as time goes on and I think as numbers come in, it becomes more and more evident to those of us who are pumpers in the basin that we need to look more and more towards sub-basin management. It's going to be very important to all of us. I think Carol said it quite clearly, and the numbers, or the colors, I guess, quite were honest. They were blue towards the Las Posas Basin where I am. And I think that's going to be important. We need to be looking at what the flows are coming down the creeks. We understand the challenges that Lake Piru faces. We understand the challenges that the Forebay faces. I'm not saying that isn't an issue, because it is. I mean, we understand the issue that people are facing with the waters that are not coming. That's very clear. But I think it behooves all of us when we talk about an industry and a county whose livelihood is based on water. We need to be very thoughtful and very engaging and allow people to speak, but also look at some of the facts. I think Carol was really good in her comment about how she's got a third less water now being pumped. I think that's very indicative because we're getting through this cycle. And I would just reiterate the point that I hope we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because we're not through this complete cycle. I myself have been working diligently to monitor my water in a monthly manner so that I can see where I am coming towards the end of the year. I think all of us as growers are very concerned about that, and we want to see where this ends up. My comments, just we got to give it some time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. I think staff is ready for some direction from us.
Director Westedder.
Director West.
I guess to reiterate the last comment, I tend to agree. Director Bennett, I think it would be appropriate for the board to consider all manner of allocation systems in deference to emergency ordinance E to see how that plays out. But I don't think that there's a need to have one allocation system across different basins. And as difficult as that process and those decisions may be, it may be time for, ultimately, once we see the way this season plays out, it may ultimately be time to look at different allocation systems depending on the needs of each individual basin. Treating the system as if it's one pool. A doesn't work, and B isn't realistic. And and that may advantage some areas and disadvantage other areas. That's life. Sustainability may require that. It's something we need to look at.
Just a few things. One, I believe I understand IAI. I just don't believe IAI is likely to be something that we're going to be able to make work in the long run. Two, I'm not proposing that we throw it out next month. I'm only trying to, I know it takes, as we've heard here, it takes a long time for us to take action on anything. I just want to throw it out there as something to consider at the right time in the cycle. But you have to make a change like that at the right time in the cycle, and it would throw everybody a curve if next month we threw out IAI at the same time we spent all this time trying to do it. But I think I want to get that out on the table that there may be some other way for us to make this decision. The two other points that I would like to make is I appreciate and I'm not opposed to looking at these various basins, but I think that we have to be cautious to not create each basin as an island doing what they want and not recognize that there is an interrelationship between these basins. You can't march down the Santa Clara River, you can't march down the Ventura River without for sure seeing that. You basically have rivers that are running underground. And there is some relations between the basins all the way through. That's why Fox Canyon was put together, right? And so just want to make sure that we recognize that at the same time that there are conversations. And the final thing I just would like to offer, I appreciate Rob talking about, some other way. Whenever you have these kind of problems, it tendency to want to try to, but the decisions that are going to solve this problem are going to be decisions that are going to be worked out in a public forum, and they're going to be decided in a public forum. And maybe it's a workshop, and maybe it's something else, but it has to be in a public forum. As much as it's frustrating, and there would be a desire to sort of have in the back room a few people kind of work this out. People can do what they want, and they got to bring it here, and it's got to be properly vetted. Everybody's livelihoods are on the line, and there's just not going to be any other way that's going to happen. So, with that, you're asking. They're asking for feedback. Feedback is we have some concerns. I have concerns about how it's working. I'm not saying it's not working at all. And I really appreciate Carol giving us some numbers. We'll have to see where we go, but I want us to stay open to and begin the process of thinking about other allocation systems if we get to the point where we go, hey, we don't know how to adjust IAI to get the next level of cuts. That's where I would leave it.
Robert, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. I'm not ready to throw out IAI, but I think there's a fundamental issue with IAI that's not being addressed, and if it can be addressed, I can come on board with it. And that is IAI is not tied to the supply. There's my problem with it. If some way you can tie it to the supply, whether that is put allocation back on the land that we're looking at up in Las Posas or something, then I can get on board with it and sell it and be able to go along with it. But the problem is also that's going along with this, we heard about a desal plant from United Water going down there and coming online and giving 20,000 acre feet of water. Realistically, that's 10 years off. We don't have 10 years to keep in mind in order to be able to do that. The groundwater conditions report just came out from United here at the beginning of this month, and it reported a 94,000 acre foot shortfall last year alone. There's 219,000 acre feet of water that was pumped or extracted within the United service territories, and an overdraft of 94,000 for last year. You can't keep going along that and hope that your panacea shows up in 10 years. That math don't work. So there is something that's got to get us between where we are today, and while I give Ordinance E a couple more months in order to do it, boy, you're going to have to pull it on in that second quarter or second half of that game in order to make those numbers work. Because right now, the first set that we see coming up here, and I'm not so sure we're going to make it. So my direction going forward, or what I would like to see, yes, we got to run this at least one full cycle to see where we're at and see what the numbers are going to be as far as whether it was a success or whether it was a shortfall, and what kind of volume we're looking at the next round of cuts are going to have to be and on whom they're going to have to be on in order to get the numbers to work. Realize that any option we have out there for a new supply coming online is not immediate. It's not in 5 years. It doesn't matter if you want to go Great Phase 2. That's 5 years. Our desal plant's 10 years. We got to get something between now and then, and that's probably going to be demand reduction. And then how do you tie IAI to supply?
Okay. Any other comments? So what is our... Yes.
There's a lot of great points made today, and like Mr. Saperson said, it illustrates the trouble we have with moving forward on issues, and that the frustration I think all of us feel about the pace of the way things get done in this agency. Nevertheless, it's Director Bennett said it well. It ultimately has to be vetted in the public space. We're a public agency, and it's just going to take some time. A couple of things that haven't been mentioned here that I just wanted to highlight, and I think pretty much all the points I can agree with in certain aspects of just about all of them. I agree with the sense of urgency that we have in this agency, and I share it. But I wanted to remind the directors that the concept when we embarked on the emergency ordinance E was the idea that giving farmers the certainty to finish out their leases, plant those crops that they had already ordered the seeds for, or the seedlings for, particularly the strawberry crop is getting to a point of finishing up soon, I believe. There's decisions underway right now. People are thinking about what they hear, the availability of water coming up. They're perhaps making adjustments in leases. They're making plans of fallowing land. These things are underway. In the area of the Las Posas, where there's a majority of permanent crops, we've already seen decreases in the pumping. That tells me that what we've started has had some benefit. And I think we'll continue to see those benefits as we go forward. They just haven't materialized yet because we haven't gotten through the whole system. Another curiosity that I just would throw in there, and it appears to me that hitting these targets, these numbers, is very rain dependent. If we had a normal rain year, I think we'd all be thinking about this may not even be on our agenda. We'd have hit those targets simply because, particularly in the Las Posas, we'd have shut off the pumps. In fact, we did in December. We didn't irrigate at all, and a good part of January. And I would even say that in M&I, the landscape irrigation that goes on, particularly that controlled by municipalities, is all under automatic clocks and rain sensors and trying to be very efficient. These things all come into account. Simple fact of rain changes the sense of whether we hit those numbers or not. And so being so narrowly focused on hitting target numbers and then making a very quick reaction to say, well, obviously that's not working, emergency E is a total failure, I can't go along with that statement. It's a little bit brash. I do agree we need to let these things play themselves out. I'm not opposed to different allocation methods. I was involved in the IAI scheme, and it's an allocation method. And in fact, the Area Y farm in the Las Posas is coming up right now with a different allocation method, and it's one that everyone's kind of come together on. And in fact, those tough decisions are being made. Life isn't understood to be the same. People aren't grabbing onto those last straws. In fact, they're making the changes now. They're making the hard decisions. So I'm a little bothered by the characterization that we've all got to wake up, because the wake up has occurred. The emergency ordinance and all the meetings and all the attention we've had this past year was the wake up call. So anyway, I would move that we continue to let this thing play out. Let's see what happens on the Oxnard Plain this next half, because I think we're going to see some real changes in water use. And let's be cognizant of being too hasty and too knee-jerk on this thing.
Okay, we have a motion.
I just asked Director Borcher a question, and I really appreciate your comments. You had mentioned that you shut your wells off in December. You didn't irrigate because you had good rain in December. And, you know, we heard about there's been a decrease in water. A year ago, December, did you irrigate? Because we had a little bit better rain this winter than last winter, is that right?
It's curious you asked that, because I went back through our records from the last 3 winters. And it's very apparent when we start to see, I can pinpoint it right now, in the 2013-14 rain year. We had a 5.2 inch rain at the end of February, early March. It was a series of rains. We shut off irrigation there for the entire month of March. And then things kick in like east wind, and it causes the change. Terry Schaefer does a weather report, and whenever we have east wind, he calls it a negative rain event. And it's precisely that. Right. This past year, 2014-15 winter, December 2nd, 1.5 inches. December 15th, 0.4 inches. January 10, we had 2.4. So December, January, we didn't irrigate at all. So for permanent crops, rain makes all the difference in the world whether we hit those numbers. And yet, is that a function of true savings? Well, yes, we didn't pump the aquifer. But this is not simply an extraction number problem.
So it's possible that the decrease this year that Carol was referring to is in this first part of the year is because of better rain, and in the second half of the year we may or may not get a change from the second half of last year.
It is possible, yes, and that's the point I'm trying to make. It's not strictly a pumping issue; it's also a rain issue. And again, so saying based on gross extraction numbers, emergency ordinance E hasn't worked, doesn't tell the whole story.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to repeat your motion?
Not even sure what motion I made.
I don't know. I heard I move, so I
don't move.
I think we all need to know what it is the motion is.
I move to receive and file.
Okay.
I agree.
Is there a second to receive and file?
Second.
Okay, there's a motion, a second to receive and file the report, but what they were looking for was direction. Have you heard enough direction?
I think so. In February, there was a lot of discussion about the direction, and part of that included coming back in April with some other specific items for your board, so we'll continue to do that.
Well, hold on, Rick. I'm not... You're saying we're going to come back in April with... I'm not sure that...
Let me know.
Perhaps clear direction from the board in terms of the timing.
Was there clear direction to come back in April before?
There was direction to come back in April with additional information.
This was just to give us the second half of the numbers. You've got the second half of the numbers.
Okay.
We haven't made any motion to change anything. You've had 5. I just think we'd be forever trying to craft a motion that captured what all 5 of us said here.
Okay.
Okay.
So we haven't changed our recommendation. Right? If somebody wants to change it, they can.
Well, we have a motion on the floor and a second. Is there any objection to receive and file? So ordered. Okay. We have a closed session, but we also have an executive officer's report. Is there a motion to receive and file the executive officer's report?
So,
is there a second? There's a motion and a second to receive the administrative officer's report. I'm going to ask the attorney to give us the words under which we will go into closed session and tell us if we expect an announcement at the end.
Yes, Chair Craven, the board will be adjourning to closed session to discuss the litigation matter identified as item 10 on the agenda, and I do not expect there to be any announcement out of closed session.
Okay. We'll recess to a closed session. Aye.